A regular ATF. That's the one that I don't like. Yeah, that's okay. I've micro. Yeah, but cable over there. That's just send an update that break. So that's but I'm wondering so welcome. This is going to be the suit buff. We're currently working through some technical issues with the AV, so we'll get started as soon as we get that worked out.
Okay, if you're sitting here looking for something to do, we are still in need of a Jabber scribe and still in need of a second note taker. So is there anybody here that's going to be in the Jabber room that'd be willing to monitor the Jabber room? Here? Okay, thank you. We have one note taker right now. Can we get a second note taker? So we have an Ether pad. The link is up there, but it's a regular Ethernet pad for this session. And so if we can get 2 people to be updating the Ether pad, is there a second person that would be willing to watch the Ether pad or send us their own notes afterwards? Don't care which. Note taker volunteer? Note taker volunteer? Again, we already have one. We just need a backup note taker. Who said I'll do it? Okay, yeah. Thanks, Tim Polk. You can. This is sufficient right now. Yeah, but if you change your resolution, you can. This will work with this section. All right, we're good to go.
So, okay, I think we're about to get started. As I mentioned earlier, this is SUIT, the proposed working group that was originally called FUD. We changed the name in the interim since IETF 99. At IETF 99, we had a side meeting in which we began talking pretty intensively about the charter, our hopes today is to continue that conversation and actually work on refining the charter as much as possible. So, SUIT. The goal of SUIT is to standardize software update capabilities. One of our primary goals for this effort is to come up with something that will work with constrained devices. We're specifically trying to target Class 1 constrained devices that have 10 kilobytes of RAM and around 100 kilobytes of flash capability. This is a working group forming, BOF. Are we bringing the slides up? Yeah, okay. So we're working on fixing the AV so that the slides also show up on Meet Echo. So just bear with us a moment. The blue sheets are on their way around. We have a couple of note takers. Tim Polk and Mike Rosa have both offered to take notes for this session, and Stephen Panghart will be in the Jabber room as our Jabber scribe. So thank you to all of you for volunteering to help. My name is Dave Waltermeyer. My co-chair for this effort is Russ Housley. Unfortunately, Russ couldn't make it to this event, so Dave Thaler has graciously offered to step in. So thank you, Dave. Okay, great. Can someone confirm that the slides are visible on Meet Echo? Yes? Great, thank you. Okay, so next slide, please. So this is the IETF Notewell. I'm sure you all have seen this at least once when you registered. This is just a quick reminder that that this is a meeting under the IETF rules. So any contributions that you make are being contributed to the IETF. This is our agenda for today. So we're going to focus on, I'm going to do a read of the proposed charter text. Then we're going to have what we're hoping to be around a 45-minute charter discussion. If we end up going long, we're going to focus on the charter instead of some discussion of some new work items. And then we're going to wrap up the meeting with a quick review of our proposed milestones and talk about next steps. Any agenda bashing? Okay. I already talked about this. We've dealt with that. Okay, so charter review. So we've had lots of conversation on the charter over the last few months since IETF 99. It seems like most of the focus has been on a fairly narrow portion of the charter text. So we're going to be talking about that in a little bit. The charter so far has been through internal review with initial ISG and IAB reviews. We've gotten some feedback on that. Currently, it's scheduled for. Currently, the process of external review has started on the charter, and it's scheduled for the 11:30 telechat. So we're hoping to get the charter wrapped up fairly quickly, so that things can progress. So during this review of the charter text, there's a few things that we want you to focus on. Primarily, we want to know that the charter text is clear or not, and we want to work to clarify any concerns with the charter. We want to know if the charter captures accurately the work that is being proposed, and we want to make sure that it's work that we can move on fairly quickly. One of our goals for this proposed effort is to produce something in a fairly short amount of time, so that we can influence software updating capabilities in the industry. So one of the things that we would like to not focus on for this initial effort is to define a transport protocol for exchanging software updates. So the work that we're going to be doing is largely going to be focused on a manifest mechanism that allows verification of the integrity of a software update, targeting of the software update to a given platform, and origin, or being able to verify the origin of a given software update. So with that, I think we're going to flip to the actual charter text. Can you, I think Colin is in
Can I just ask a quick question?
Sure.
Alyssa Cooper, when you say we, who do you mean by we?
We.
Yeah.
So we, so this has been a point of conversation, I think, in some of our early meetings around this effort. There's something that we've acknowledged in some of those early conversations is that there's a lot of existing work going on around defining transport mechanisms. There's a lot of already existing transport mechanisms out there for software updates. The discussion that we've had to date is largely focused on the fact that we don't want to further, we don't want to create yet another transport solution in this space. The one thing that has been missing through a lot of the current efforts is a solution that would provide the capabilities of a manifest format. And so the discussion has really been around trying to focus on those aspects. So we are the the participants that have been working to define this charter.
Okay, so this is like you with your proponent hat on. It's just like it was a little bit unclear when you say that. It's like, and this is a little bit of a novel process as well because there's a BOF, but the charter is already out for external review. So I just wanted to understand, it's like, this is you and your personal opinion is that this is what we are or are not going to do, as opposed to some other version of we.
Sure.
Okay, thanks.
Colin's next in line.
Yes. Colin, go
Colin,
ahead.
you're up.
Okay, I'm a little bit unclear when I'm actually connected, but hopefully I am here.
Yep, we see you and hear you.
Perfect. Okay, so I want to ask about this defining a new transport versus selecting one that's using what many people have proposed. So a big group of we that does not seem to be the same we is that that the most important thing is actually define how the interoperability works between a device that gets firmware from the server, and that there's several transport protocols that are used there, and that our architecture, in fact, I believe the current charter that's before the ISG actually does talk about the framework for getting and selecting one of those. So though I agree we do not want to define a new transport, I think we do want to discuss which transports are used as part of the architecture and framework. So is that out of scope or not? A clarifying question on what you meant there.
I think that's one of the questions that we'd like to talk about today, which is, how do existing transport relate to the contents of the manifest?
So I think this is Dave speaking from Jared. I believe the discussion is that defining a new transport or transfer protocol is out of scope, but discussion of use of existing ones and how you might use them without changes is in scope. And I see Dave Walter nodding. So does that answer your question, Cullen?
Yes, it does. That's very clear. Thank you.
Okay, so I'd like to move on since we're short on time to discussion of the charter. So I'm going to read through the charter. Please, if you have constructive comments about changes to the charter, let's hold those until we actually get to the discussion portion of this. Focus only on clarifying questions relating to the charter, please. So the charter says vulnerabilities in Internet of Things devices has raised the need for a secure firmware update mechanism that is also suitable for constrained devices. Security experts, researchers, and regulators recommend that all IoT devices be equipped with such a mechanism. While there are many proprietary firmware update mechanisms in use today, there is a lack of a modern interoperable approach to securely updating the software in IoT devices. A firmware update solution consists of several components, including a mechanism to transport firmware images to IoT devices, a manifest that provides metadata about the firmware image, such as a firmware package identifier, the hardware the package needs to run on, dependencies on other firmware packages, as well as cryptographic information for protecting the firmware image in an end-to-end fashion. The firmware image, and also a solution consists of the firmware image itself. So RFC 4108 defines a manifest format today that uses the cryptographic message syntax to protect firmware packages. So more than 10 years have passed since the publication of RFC 4108, and greater experience with IoT deployments has led to additional functionality requiring the work done with RFC 4108 to be revised. This group will focus on defining a firmware update solution for Class 1 devices, and as defined in RFC 7228, that is IoT devices with roughly 10 kilobytes of RAM and roughly 100 kilobytes of flash. The solution may apply to more capable devices as well. This group will not define any transport mechanisms. In June of 2016, the Internet Architecture Board organized a workshop on Internet of Things software updates, which took place at Trinity College in Dublin, Ireland. The main goal of the workshop was to foster a discussion on requirements, challenges, and solutions for bringing software and firmware updates to IoT devices. This workshop also made clear that there are challenges with misaligned incentives and complex value chains. It's nevertheless seen as important to create standard building blocks that help interested parties implement and deploy a solid firmware update mechanism. I can pause there for a question.
Yeah, Alan Durand, I have a clarifying question on the Class 1 device. Is it assumed that this device has enough energy to actually do the transfer itself? Because in 7228, I couldn't find anything related to the supply of energy there.
Yes, I believe the assumption is yes.
Thank you.
So continuing on with the charter, in particular, this group aims to publish several documents, namely an IoT firmware update architecture that includes a description of the involved entities, security threats, and assumptions, and also one or more manifest format specifications. So we've had a couple of interesting discussions on the mailing list, focused around some text on what the initial work of this working group will be. I'm going to read first the text that is actually on the charter that's on the data tracker, and then I'd like to read some text that was proposed by Paul Hoffman. I believe the second paragraph, the text proposed by Paul Hoffman, might be a better place for us to start the conversation today. So the first paragraph, which is the text on the data tracker, states that the initial focus of this group will be development of a manifest approach based on CMS and the ASN1 encoding. This work will result in a revision to RFC 4108 that reflects the current best practices. Use of the ASN1 encoding is desirable due to existing AS1 support in crypto libraries used within current IoT operating systems. The group may later adopt alternate manifest formats using other serialization approaches, for example, CBOR. So the text that Paul Hoffman had suggested is the initial focus of this group will be development of the contents of a manifest. Once there is general agreement on the contents, the group will pick one format and its associated cryptographic mechanisms to encode the manifest. And there, if you could scroll down. So then the charter continues by saying this group does not aim to create a standard for a generic software update mechanism for use by rich operating systems like Linux, but instead this group will focus on software development practices in the embedded industry. Software update solutions that target updating software other than the firmware binary, for example, updating scripts, are also out of scope. The group will aim to maintain a close relationship with silicon vendors and OEMs that develop IoT operating systems. So any clarifying questions on the charter?
Just a few.
Paul Hoffman. So this is not about my text. This is about something else, but it sort of feeds into this. RFC 4108 seems to take up a big place in this, that this is for revising and such. I'm not sure that that's at all appropriate. The IOTSU workshop barely talked about 4108. 4108 is a format that is standardized in the IETF, but it wasn't done in a working group. I mean, it had plenty of input. A bunch of us in the room actually, were part of that.
Yeah.
But that doesn't seem like a good place for starting just because it exists. So I would suggest that we might also consider taking out anything about 4108, especially because the early work that we're seeing isn't 4108-ish, and it doesn't have the same properties that 4108 even said about itself. So I'm, in case other people are saying, oh, but 4108 is this or that, I'm not sure that we want to necessarily have a focus on that.
Right, and I actually have a discussion point on that for later on. Yes?
Hi, Alan Joanna again. Could you please show the bottom of your text?
Which part?
Just scroll up.
Up. Okay.
Oh, well, I just want to see the last paragraph.
The last line.
Of last.
Right before the milestone.
Right. Oh, down. Okay. Sorry. Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah. You say target updating software other than the firmware binary. That somehow implies there's only one binary.
One of the things we've been talking about is the fact that there may be multi-part updates that are shipped as a single update, but that update multiple things.
You can, I think, Alon, you're suggesting something like that, right?
Yes.
Something like that.
Yes.
I see.
Like, just give you an example, like on a camera, you may have a firmware for the camera body and another piece of binary, another firmware for the lens.
We're projecting the charter this way so we can do live editing if there's easy edits to do and address things. So.
That's right.
Brett Jordan, I like Paul's text, and I think that is a good addition to the document, and I do fully support this this effort. So,
Noted. Thank you.
Eric, not Mark. So following on to what Alain was saying, that, yeah, I think that people have, what's in 4108, and then which I think applies more generally, is you have multiple pieces of firmware because it's the soft radio that's a separate chip, whatever, right, a microcontroller, and it has a separate piece of firmware. So I think that generalization is a necessary one. I don't understand what a script is.
You don't understand
what a script is, as opposed to a piece of binary code, just because of whatever byte encoding is of something that is Python, as opposed to something that's interpreted by something else, which happens to be some instruction set. That seems like a rather arbitrary thing. I think that the key thing is that we shouldn't actually. This is not building a package update system like we have in traditional operating systems, right? Or the rich operating systems. And it's the fact that it takes a small number of pieces of software. Typically, they're compiled things, but I don't see why that's a hard requirement that they can't be interpreted by something.
I think this is actually a little bit related to the TEEP relationship that we'll get to later, but I hear Eric arguing to essentially delete the mention of scripts because you find that more distracting than helpful. Is that right? And so that would be Eric's suggestion.
Hi, this is Hannes. I want to respond to Eric's question. I believe this was added in response to some email traffic on the question of whether the use of JavaScript-like dialogues or Python-like dialogues is in scope or not. And I believe the conclusion was, in the end, that we want to start with something sort of more restricted in scope than updating sort of Cherry script or MicroPython and so on those devices. I believe that that's a more pragmatic approach for what the market does today. While there are indeed some experiments and effort ongoing to have some very sophisticated IoT devices that can actually download code from various different places and execute them.
Alexander Pelov. So I'm just going to say on another topic about the text proposed by Paul Hoffman. I like this one better than
Speak
the
a
other
little
one.
louder, please.
Sorry?
A little bit louder.
Okay. So I like better the text proposed by Paul Hoffman here, and I think that it reflects better the discussions that were on the mailing list before actually we got the text.
Right. I saw lots of people, I saw a number of people arguing on the list that there are things in here that they disagree with, and I haven't heard anybody picking on the text proposed by Paul, and so far I think there is, okay, we got two people in the room. I'll go to you in just a second here. So far I have not yet heard arguments against Paul's text, and so we're leaning towards a rough consensus unless this room and this meeting actually changes that. So David, you're up.
Yes, just one quick clarifying question about the point we were at earlier with the firmware binaries. I was wondering about the scope versus the trusted execution updates where
we have a slide on that we'll get to in a second to generate the discussion relationship there. So
that should be fine.
If you want to hold your question until we get to that slide.
Yes. That's
okay. Then you're welcome to get back in the queue. So I'm going to move on to this. Okay. You're up. We don't have audio. We see you.
Suhas, I don't think your audio is working.
Yeah, no audio. If you want to put a chat question in the Jabber room, our Jabber scribe can relay for you.
Thank you. So if there are no other...
We'll wait a second in case he has something on the Jabber chat. Go ahead.
I was just going to say we can come back to his question probably a little bit later during the discussion portion. Let's switch back to the slides and start the discussion portion. No, back. It's the relationship to TEEP. Oh, yes. So I think actually the next part of the discussion, so one of the things that we've been talking about, the fact that there's a TEEP off this week and that there is a potential relationship between the two efforts. So Dave is going to have some conversation on resolving that relationship.
Okay, so there's been some discussion both offline as well as on the mailing list for TEEP and the mailing list for SUIT. I don't know for sure, but certainly on the mailing list for TEEP about what's the relationship, can we share mechanisms, and so on. And so if you're not familiar, on Wednesday there's another BOF, which is the TEEP BOF, and a large portion of you, if you're in this room, would probably be interested in that one. And so that one, here's the little description. It's about how do you get code into a trusted execution environment. Okay, so it's very relevant to putting code on things. That's kind of the relationship there. Okay. Now, it is also in the category of having a draft charter, and it's a working group forming BOF for the purpose of the BOF on Wednesday, as to talk about proposed charter text. Okay. And so when talking about the scope of them, now is the right time for both suit and TEEP to say, what's the right charter text for both of them to make it clear what's the division of labor should they both be chartered as working groups, right? So next, okay, now here we go. So if you read the draft charter text posted on the data tracker for both groups, you'll notice there is some overlap, okay? And so this week is the time for us to clean that up and reflect whatever the community thinks is the right relationship between those two. So if you do a compare and contrast of the current wording, not the one that we just edited, right, but the current wording that's posted on the data tracker for the two, you notice a couple of things that are sort of the compare and contrast. The first one is that the charter text for TEEP focuses on code or installation of code into a trusted execution environment, regardless of whether it's for IoT or not. Okay, I mean, it has two use cases. There's the IoT use case and the non-IoT use case, but they're both sort of listed as being in scope for the TEEP because it has a trusted execution environment. Okay, whereas SUIT focuses on installation of code into an IoT device, regardless of whether it's in a TEE or not. Okay, so you can say, okay, well, there's a little bit of overlap if you only look at the first bullet, okay, which is if it's a TEE inside of an IoT device, then it's in the overlap, right? If you were to only look at the first bullet. Again, this is current wording. The last questions I want to get to is what should the division of labor be? What should the text in either of them say? And we'll have the same discussion over in the TEEP BOF, because if we conclude that the SUIT charter is fine and the TEEP charter text should change, that's the Wednesday discussion. Okay. Second thing that you'd notice if you read both of them is that the TEEP text talks about how do you get code there the first time, but doesn't currently contain any text about how might you update it. And the SUIT text talks about updating, but it doesn't talk about how it gets there the first time. Okay, maybe that's by design. Okay, point is, one is talking about how do I get code the first time, and SUIT talks about how do you do updates of things that are already present. Okay, that's the second thing that's sort of different. The third thing is actually the one that I said I had the bullet on in the question that we had a second ago across Meetecho, which is the text that's in there talks about apps and firmware. But what I think we really mean, this was getting back to the scripts question. Okay, I think in the side discussion we concluded that what TEEP focuses on is not the stuff that's used to boot. It's the stuff that might be installed to run later on, and so that's what we mean by an app. And so on a class 1 device, there may be no such thing, for example, right? Because all that runs is what comes up at boot. Whereas SUIT focuses on, sometimes it uses the word software in the charter text. Sometimes it uses the word firmware in the charter text, and sometimes it uses software or firmware. So if we were to go back to there, you do a search through, some places it says software, some places it says firmware, some places it has an or. Okay. Now, the proposed intent of what we think that people mean is that SUIT focuses on the stuff that's used to boot. And so when we say firmware, we mean sort of the piece of code that's in that class 1 device that comes up at boot and you're trying to flash that or update that. Whereas TEEP is not about that at all. It's about things like things that I grab from an app store, okay, which is clearly not sort of the firmware stuff, okay. So we can figure out what the right terminology is, but I think that the intent, at least our understanding of those who have commented on the SUIT and TEEP stuff, is that that one is, we believe, disjoint between the two, okay, meaning sort of the OS-like firmware versus the applications that run on top of it after boot, okay. Now maybe we can clean up the language and stuff there, but and the intent here is not to have a mic line to talk about the terminology unless there's some really trivial wording thing to do, but I don't want to, that's not the main focus. The main focus is what's the right scope, okay? Now that you've seen these 3 different things, how they overlap or don't overlap when you put all 3 axes together, okay? Now if we go back to the SUIT text, is there anything that we should change to make it clear of what the scope is for what SUIT should do versus what TEEP should do if they're both chartered as working groups, okay? So now the question here is, what should the work split be? And so what's the intent? Okay, what do you want the intent to be? And then what, if any, changes do we need to make in the SUIT charter text to reflect the intent? So let's first talk about what do we think the intent is of what SUIT should do versus TEEP should do. Okay, so Eric.
Eric Nordmark, I think there's another difference which you're not covering, which is sort of what does validating mean in these things? And I think that TEEP has a more complex model in that space, right? Where there's more parties involved in terms of who actually signs what and who sort of is authoritative for what. And you might have things like that in SUIT as well if there could be cases when there's someone that signs the manifest, so there's a validation of that against some sort of root of trusts, whatever, security association, depending upon the mechanism. And you might have a separate one for the actual firmware you download if that's not part of the manifest itself, potentially, right? But it's still a lot simpler than I think what TEEP is trying to do.
Mhm.
So I think it might make sense to flag that as one of the differences as well, and then saying, okay, is there some sharing going on there, and or is this just sort of, yeah?
Yeah, I know among the TEEP proponents, there is I think on the TEEP list it was mentioned, gee, it sure would be nice if we could maybe share some of the things that SUIT is doing or might be applicable to us. So maybe a manifest format or something, who knows? But that's really for TEEP to discuss as to how much of SUIT stuff would be relevant to them. But they don't want to reinvent stuff that would be in SUIT if it were reusable. But right now it's unknown whether something would be reusable. Okay, Hannes.
I liked your proposal on the work split with these apps versus firmware, and maybe that requires the charter text, for example.
Sorry, did you say you agree or disagree?
I agree.
You agree.
Maybe the language for example, SUIT, as we changed the terminology or the name of this effort, maybe wasn't that appropriate because it leaves the impression that it's more generic than it's actually supposed to be.
SUIT is certainly a generic enough name that it leads people to believe that there's a heavy overlap with TEEP, yes.
And in case of TEEP, when it was proposed in Chicago at the BOP, it was the primary use case back then and still is the use of in smartphones. And there, if you look at the charter that we just, David just read, it talked about the real world, a normal operating system versus sort of IoT operating systems. And for example, in a trust zone based DE, we're actually talking about two operating systems there, not just one big one like Linux, but also another one, a real-time operating system. So that would be bigger.
Yep.
But of course, the IoT terminology is often very confusing, but you have to put it there in the charter somewhere to attract the right audience. But IoT has such a wide notion that some people refer to mobile phones as IoT and some people not. So that makes it a little tricky.
Okay, thank you. There's also somebody in the Meet Echo. I don't know who is in the line next. Meet Echo? Can we go to Meet Echo next?
Hi, do you hear me? Okay. I totally agree with Dave that we probably have to clean up our language, software versus firmware and things like that. Also agree with Hannes in that we need to be careful to actually use the IoT lingo because these are the people we need to talk to. Now, I had one specific comment about what Dave said with this focusing on this boot differentiation. I think it could be a nice differentiator with TEEP, but if we look at the actual solutions that are currently developed for firmware updates, the bootloader aspect is completely different from the image and might create a wrong impression that you're actually updating the whole binary that's working on the device, including the bootloader, which is actually not the case. So I'm not sure how if we can really use this aspect of booting as easily as you suggested to differentiate that.
Okay. Let's go to the floor, Mike. Thank you.
So I don't want to derail the current conversation, but there are some delayed questions about the charter on Jabber. So at some point, I think for the people on Jabber, we'd like to go back and voice those comments. So not right now.
Let's do that after we finish this topic.
Just want to make sure it didn't get left behind.
Thank you.
Fergus, you have a mic comment?
I'm not on Jabber, but I would like to get in the same queue on the charter.
Okay. Yep.
So Alexander Perl. So here on this question, I really like the way you boiled it down, and for me it also comes down a little bit to on the exact charter that we're talking about in SUIT. So is it the manifest, like the contents we're going to put in the manifest? Like, is this the first topic here? And if it is, maybe it is something that people can just say, okay, well, all these things that the SUIT guys defined in their manifest, well, maybe we should support it. And, you know, and in future versions, they see exactly how these two relate to each other. I mean, I like very much this separation between apps and firmware, you know, but this is like going down into exactly how the process is going and so forth. But if we're limited to the manifest file and say, okay, you need this information and you get something that has some cryptographic information assigned to it from this place, I think this is something that could be pretty generic. And TEEP seems more like with a larger scope, and SUIT seems like a pretty much focused on IoT. So for me, it's a pretty clear separation if we limit to the manifest of the information we put in this manifest file.
And that's one of the reasons why we have been talking about on the SUIT list about narrowing the scope to something that we can easily understand, do quickly, while we learn more about the broader space, and then maybe do more later.
So I'm going to summarize what I've heard so far, and then we'll probably go to the Jabber queue next. So far, I've heard support for changing some language, potentially in the SUIT chart. So I'm focused on feedback for SUIT as opposed to feedback for TEEP. We're potentially changing some language regarding the third bullet about, you know, software versus firmware, and maybe updating the language there somehow to reflect the intent, which I think I heard positive feedback about the intent of the third bullet. I think people tend to agree with the way that we talked about it before. I did not hear anybody arguing that the SUIT charter needed to change any way to address anything in the first or second bullet. The TEEP charter may need be, but what I've heard is that if you update the third bullet, nobody's asking for any changes after the third bullet changes, because there's already a division of labor between there. Whether there sounds like there's any overlap on the first two bullets is not as important, because the distinction is on the third bullet. That's what I've heard so far. If I've got that wrong, let me know, because otherwise that's what I see as kind of the emerging feedback from the room. So unless there's any other comments on that, then let's go to the Jabber queue.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what I said. We're going to go to the Jabber queue next. So whoever is a Jabber scribe, please come up.
No, we're going to go to MeetEcho.
Going to MeetEcho. Oh, thank you. Sorry, I thought you said Jabber. Okay, MeetEcho.
David, go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to bring up an interaction between the part of the charter describing Class 1 devices and the issue of TEEP, that I would certainly see that a device that's considered Class 1 is probably not going to be able to have space for a separate trusted execution and other image. But if SUIT was covering larger devices, I could see an IoT device having a separate trusted execution with those kind of requirements of multiple signatures and those kind of things that would be coming from TEEP. I just wanted to bring up that interaction there on the charter.
So David, you used a word that I didn't, and that word was separate.
Okay.
In a Class 1 device, it might be that the whole thing is the trusted execution environment, and there is no untrusted execution environment. So in other words, there can be different types of Class 1 devices, and you're right, Class 1 might not be separate, but it doesn't mean that they wouldn't necessarily have a trusted execution environment. But the third bullet on here is the one that says what's in scope for which one, at least from what we're talking about right now.
Okay.
Which is, if you're talking about a Class 1 device that only has a trusted execution environment, and that's the firmware, that would be in SUIT, but might actually entail some of the interaction and review from TEEP people, if this is the right direction to go. But I think that's a good question to raise, but that's how I read it anyway. I don't know if people have comments. David, do you want to respond?
I would say the only thing is, do we cover such, say, a Class 2 or 3 device where maybe the images actually are separate, but they're still both firmware? And would that be considered TEEP or SUIT as far as scope, would be the question I would raise.
So that, I'm looking at David Waltermeyer to say, is a Class 2 device, is updating firmware on a Class 2 device considered to be in scope or not? Right now, the proposed charter text says that it is out of scope, and you're asking, is that the right thing?
Actually, I don't believe it says that it's out of scope. I believe what it says is that we are focusing on Class 1 devices, but if the resulting solution works for more capable devices, that's okay too.
All right, so that was Kathleen as AD saying exactly what Dave said. So thank you.
Chris Rulon, I want to follow up on David's comments. I agree. I disagree that this should be limited to Class 1 devices.
Okay.
In real-world exploitation, since the draft leads with vulnerability patching, as a security guy, all of the IoT botnets out there today affect Class 2 or 3 IoT devices. Nothing affects class 1, so it's not really solving a problem.
Yeah, right. I agree. So I'm co-chairing the TEEP BOF as well, and I think what I've seen on the TEEP BOF was they would love for it to apply to other things that TEEP would apply to, which are not necessarily class 1. So I think we'll verify that on Wednesday, but my expectation is the TEEP BOF would be very happy to hear that you are not scoping it down to only class 1. Okay. Anything else, David, or should we go on to the Jabber comments?
No, that is it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so so Stephen?
Jabber Scribe, you're up.
So these are comments that are on the charter. So if the chairs are ready to go back to the charter, give those.
Okay.
Okay, so I apologize for the reading of your name, but these are two comments from Suhas Nanda Kumar. The first is, why are we restricting to one encoding format once we agree on data format?
Would anyone like to comment on that?
How about Paul? Oops. He's coming in the way.
So my take on this is, class 1 devices are obviously fairly small devices, as you mentioned, and the code that we are talking about here is code that goes into the bootloader. It needs to swap out, it needs to parse the things, it needs to also have the security code, and then it needs to sort of make sure that everything works and falls back to an older image if things fail. So ideally, from an implementation point of view, we don't want to provide many different formats on the wire, because we need to provide the parsers, and since the parsers here accept externally provided data, they're obviously super security sensitive, and that requires a fair amount of time. So if there's we should standardize everything that comes to our mind in terms of format, XML, JSON, everything, and plus the security mechanisms along with it, I think we would be a little unhappy because we have to provide that code. That's our.
We have a long line now. I'm just saying, Miteko Pert, you're in line behind Yari.
So Paul Hoffman, because you asked. So there is history in the IETF of crypto working groups that produced more than one format for the same thing, and they failed miserably. So just for historical reasons, I would say picking one, has always worked better. And in the one, and I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of the working group that did two, that it did a ASN1 and a JSON output. It just, everyone agreed it was a terrible mistake afterwards.
Okay, so before we move on to the rest of the queue, we do have another Jabber comment that came in earlier, so get that in now. This is also from Suhas Nanda Kumar. This is, would like to add text on architecture for how to find the server to get the firmware and how to download it. I think that's more of a comment than a question.
Suhas.
Yep. I'd like to answer. Can people hear me now? Hello?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. I'd like to answer the initial question that I asked about the encoding format. I'm not suggesting that we need to have multiple encoding formats supported by the device, but the charter itself should not basically say that the device could do one format of encoding, or support one format of encoding. The device can do one, but the server that provides the manifest can support multiple formats. If the device does not do ASN.1, but it does CBOR, it should be able to get that version of the manifest from the server, because server supports multiple. So my question was more on why are we restricting the encoding format to be one format that was on the encoding. And the second question was more on the transport mechanisms, like how do we get the firmware to the device. And I think the charter should talk about, like the earlier discussion that Cullen had about the transport mechanism, that using the existing transport mechanism, how do we find where we get the firmware from, and how do we download it? At least the charter should have some text on that, and how do we solve that in this working group. Thanks.
Okay, let's go ahead and keep moving through the queue.
Yeah, Tola Sekard. So I find the charter to be fairly imprecise or helpful to figure out which type of features in the architecture would be in and out of scope. It just refers to this wonderful workshop without pointing to a particular set of output that would be a guideline. The initial text that basically says, okay, we want to do a solid firmware upgrade scheme, and here are the components it consists of. I would kind of contest that those components are not sufficient. Right. So, for example, one of the things that I think is totally necessary for a solid upgrade is an automatic downgrade, unless some external verification has happened that the new firmware is running, or methods to query what bloody keying material you need on a firmware that will be accepted by the device because it's not on, let's say, the standard vendor keying material requirements anymore, but by keying requirements downloaded by the owner. So I'm questioning the original framework as being sufficient, and I don't understand how I can determine from the charter which of these type of features are, with the current charter, allowed to be discussed in the working group.
So based on some of the conversation we've had so far, it's capabilities in IoT devices are not ubiquitous in that regard. So some may have the ability to do a downgrade, as you've suggested, and others may not. That's one reason why we haven't constrained the scope of the work to devices with specific kinds of functionality.
Okay, so we have Martin, then Yari, then Collins after Yari, then Avat. So go ahead, Martin.
So Martin Thompson, I wanted to sort of ask about the process we're following here, because it seemed like we got a bunch of questions about the rest of the text. Paul made a comment about 4108, and we haven't done anything about addressing that. We also had a response to Fluffy's question about the transport, and the conclusion there is not very well supported in the charter as it stands right now. It says, will not define any transport mechanisms, could be read to imply the conclusion that Cullen received from that, which was to say that we're not going to touch any transport mechanisms at all, where my reading of the response to the question was that we will perhaps select one or some subset of the existing transport mechanisms and use those in some fashion. And so that needs to be clarified somewhat. So do we intend to fix this now?
The process that I'm using for editing is, if there's still a big mic line, then I'm waiting to hear what other people say to see whether that was one person or whether there seems to be, consensus or strong disagreement. And so I put in a question mark in those two places to say, those are kind of pending open questions to see. I can't tell until we drain the mic line.
Okay. So do these issues all remain open?
Well, I would like them to have direction by the time we finish this meeting. But I don't want to have direction before I give other people a chance to speak.
Sure. Okay.
Is that fair?
Yeah. So I believe this work is interesting and useful and should go forward. I did have one comment sort of relating to some of the issues that were discussed in the IAB workshop on this topic. For instance, if I have the situation where I'm an enterprise and I order a set of devices from a manufacturer, and I would actually like to have ability to update both myself and have the manufacturer update, just to support cases like the manufacturer not being in business at some point. And I think that's actually worth putting some text into the charter about, not the specific case, but something along the lines of supporting a diverse set of software sources and permissions. I looked at the architecture draft, which was nice, but it had a slightly different model in mind. It had like an and relationship between permissions, and I was kind of hoping for an or relation. So that's a possible suggestion for an addition to the charter. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cullen, you're up.
So I think this goes back to basically an easy one about when we talk about these devices, what percentage of the actual device are we talking about using the bootloader? I mean, I don't think it makes a lot of sense to say we're going to work on a class 1 device it's a big difference between using 5% of it for the bootloader, or you can use 95% of it for the bootloader. And most of the traffic being based on the idea that there would be two complete copies of the OS at the time. So most of the devices and certainly all devices I've worked with have a small bootloader.
So Colin, your audio really sucks.
Your audio is
anything you
really
can do?
choppy. It's hard to understand.
Okay. Let's try this again. It's interesting. My audio was that much different from the previous time. The topic I was trying to get at is this class 1 device. I don't understand what it means for the charter, and I think we'd have to be clear of that. What percentage of the device can the bootloader use if we're going to say it needs to work on, when you're trying to specify the size? So I think we'd be better off to talk about the size of the bootloader than a class 1 device or the specific restrictions. And the example I give is that we can't differentiate between using whether the bootloader can use 5% of the device or 95% of the device makes a really big difference. And it's this charter just totally arm waved that.
Okay.
So would you agree on changing that? You agree or disagree?
I think we need to discuss that.
Okay, but I don't want to be blown off later on we run out of time to discuss that, which seems to be the reoccurring theme here on the mailing list for the past month. So
So I'm not sure I got all of that, but what I got from it is you're also, at least in part, arguing in favor of making sure that the scope is not restricted to class 1 devices. Did I get that part of your argument correct?
I don't think we really understand what a class 1 device is, and we certainly don't understand what restricting to a class 1 device is. I think we need the charter to say we need a bootloader to run on devices where the bootloader could have these types of resources, and name those not by class 1, which makes sense to the IoT industry, by the way. But instead say whatever we think that means, take flash, or I'm not about the specific. I don't care what numbers we choose or how much RAM flash it needs to be. I think we just need to be specific about it, and where what we have right now is very confusing about it.
Yeah, so it looks like when we get to Hannes, who's 2 back on the mic, he's going to offer a suggestion. So let's go to Alon next, and feel free to jump back in the queue, Colin.
So Alan, John, I have 2 questions. The first one is the selection of a type of identifier for this type of device that is updating its firmware in scope for this working group or not?
Louder. Speak up.
Oh, it's hard to hear.
I'm sorry. Is the choice of a type of identifier in scope for this working group or not?
Choice of a type of identifier in scope. I would say I don't think the charter says one way or the other. I think it would be in scope if it's necessary to do one of the items that is mentioned. So the architecture and the manifest format are currently proposed as being in scope. And so I'd say identifier discussions would be part of those. It wouldn't be a separate item in itself. Yes. I see my co-chair nodding. So I think that's the current intent anyway.
I would maybe suggest to clarify this. And my second question...
And clarify in what way?
Saying that they are in scope.
Say what? I didn't understand what your specific suggestion is, if you have one.
Well, the device will have to identify itself to figure out what kind of firmware it needs to download, right? So we have to have an agreement on what is the identifier format
so
for this device.
I think what we're saying is, I don't think we hear the argument why it needs to bubble up into the charter text yet, as opposed to just be in the document for architecture or in the document for manifest or documents or whatever. I think that's what we're asking.
Yeah.
Is there a reason it needs to show up in the charter text because it is the scoping question? Is it big enough or whatever?
Right.
Because we're not getting why it's big enough to appear in the charter text. I think.
And my second question, and maybe you will have the same answer, is we're talking about transport, and if I'd like to discuss about a mechanism that will allow for the selection of potentially multiple transports. Will that be in scope or not?
I missed a word out of there. Are multiple transports in scope? We said before that at least what we're hearing on the list and here is that discussion of how to use existing transports, parenthesis S, like how you might use CoAP or HTTP or something under the covers, is in scope, defining that discussion about should you be capable of using HTTP, should you be capable of using coax, should you be capable of using something else, perfectly in scope for the architecture. The charter text does not have to preclude that. It just says we will not do a new one. We're not a transport area group or a transfer area group or applications or whatever. This is the security area.
Now, there is a difference between creating a new transport and having a mechanism to select which of the many existing transports.
That's correct.
Correct. So, Hannes, you have a question or comment on Cullen's point?
Yeah, I have a comment on a couple of points. One was on Yari's question of it needs to allow updates of devices other than the manufacturer. Yep. And I think the problem is that the manufacturer is a little bit used in a very generic fashion, because they actually, for devices, there are many manufacturers in that picture. You have the chip manufacturer, maybe multiple of them, because you have multiple chips and different components. Also, these are all manufacturers. You have guys that put your board together, your PCB manufacturer. You have the company that actually develops the product with maybe an OEM that provides the device, and so on and so on. So who exactly is allowed to update what is a policy decision. And I don't think we can cast this into a specification as such. That there is a decision on what firmware the device accepts for installation is obviously something that will come with as part of the security mechanism. So I don't think that needs to go into the charter text to describe on who is allowed to do the updates. On color, does that make sense?
Right.
Yeah.
You're saying something that's not in the charter right now doesn't need to be added to the charter. Great. Glad to hear it.
Thank you.
The other point that Cullen raised, he talked about the bootloader.
Yep.
And of course, there are different designs on bootloaders. And if you look at the slide deck that was uploaded from my presentation in the appendix, it has a couple of design decisions on how people design bootloaders. And the bootloader in general is part of the whole sort of class 1, class 2, these categories. And these classes shouldn't be taken too, in my opinion, shouldn't be taken too literally, like in terms of the kilobytes. But it's just a rough indication that that there's a difference between some low-end microcontroller versus your high-end server or your laptop that you have with you, a smartphone. They're just different capabilities. And if we manage to design something that works specifically well for your Linux-based device that has some software distribution platform like Docker, that's a very different software update mechanism with very different requirements, with very different players we need to talk to than going and talking to some IoT operating system developers. So I think the community is different there as well. So in that sense, I believe while this class definition is not the best one we have ever come up with, I think it's sufficient for the purpose here. That's all. I think I didn't miss anything.
Actually, I think it might be useful to poll on.
I was going to do that after we have.
Okay.
But each of the things that have a question mark on here, I think would be useful to do a poll on to see if our sense of our comments is correct or not. And so,
yes.
But I think some people have still been waiting, like Eric, and people have been waiting for a little while. So,
So Eric Nordmark. So as I read this, what we're delivering out of this group, when I read manifest specification, I read that as something that flows into the device. And I think some of the things we've touched upon is about capabilities, like the case of, is this thing capable of downgrading or falling back to the previous version of the image, whatever. And it seems like as part of that, we should make it clear, if we agree that we need to have a way of some sort of capability discovery, right? That should be explicitly stated.
Capability of discovery of what?
Of what the device can do. Can it fall back to the old version or not, for instance? And there might be other ones, right? But yeah, and maybe this is just a few bits that represent those capabilities, but still having a place where you put them might be something that we should make explicit.
The manifest format does have that, but I think your main point is about sort of capability discovery and not about noting the capabilities of the firmware itself. And so I put the placeholder here in the architecture discussion as the placeholder to capture your comment.
Oh. Okay.
Yes, next. Hi, Sean Cooley. I'd like to see this group focus more on the discoverability of update servers and the transport mechanisms used, and less on trying to make upgrades interoperable between devices. A lot of what is being specified and what I've seen so far around how exactly an update is formed, I don't think makes any sense in the IoT environment. The differences that I've seen in IoT devices are so vast that anything we do is bound to fail in that space. And I really don't think that the IoT vendors give a crap about what this group says. I think on the network discoverability side and on the transport side, the IT folks that are sitting in front of those devices and are trying to manage updates going to those devices do very much care what this group has to say. I think on the device side, we're probably better off with a simple BCP describing things like how you do signing and encryption, or that they should be there at a minimum. The rest of this just seems like us spinning our wheels.
I think in terms of time check, I think we have 20 minutes left, if I remember right. So I think we need to close the line, and we do need to do it. So Paul's been in the line, so we need to at least allow Paul. But I think Hannes, if we can call time right before you.
Yep. So Paul Hoffman. So a very short proposed update is to the group will not define any new transport mechanisms. I think that would have cleared up most of the transport questions.
Okay, got it.
And then, actually, I'm glad that the person before me just had said about discovery. I think discovery is extremely important, and I think there are plenty of discovery things. And so it could also be the group will not define any new discovery mechanisms, but that makes it clear they might be in scope.
Okay, got it. Again, anything with a question mark, I'm going to run through and get a sense of the room on each of these. So that we're getting a list. That's why I want to make sure we have enough time. So short.
Alexandru Petrescu. I would like to add a question mark on the class 1 terminology. Because I work with a particular manufacturer of device that when he says class 1, class 2, class 3, it's a laser class device. And it's not a IoT class device, okay? So I strongly question this terminology of class 1, class 2, class 3.
Yep, that's this placeholder right here. Yep.
Okay. And the second one is I would like to echo maybe a third time or a fourth time what was said in the... No, you don't hear me?
Louder.
Louder. Class 1. I question the term class 1, class 2, class 3 because I know class 1, class 2 laser devices that are IoT devices and are not class 1, class 2 IoT devices, okay? Do you understand me? If not, I will send an email.
Yes, I think I know how to phrase a question in a minute.
Yeah. The second comment I have is that I want to echo maybe a third or a fourth time what was said in the queue, that we don't know what is an IoT. It's not that it's just a small device, okay? I work a lot with IoT, and I saw those modem, ARM, PCB, module, from small device up to big platforms like IBM IoT platform, okay? It's a big server, it's a data center, okay? This IoT term is really a big misunderstanding that in this charter continues to be reflected. Okay, so yeah, I would like clarification on what it means IoT.
This is Hannes.
Yeah,
let's not define IoT, but the point I want to actually talk about was Sean's comments on.
Is this a quick point? Because we really need to move on.
Okay, I'm trying to refer to Sean's comment earlier that the IoT manufacturers don't care about what this group says. This group doesn't yet exist, so it's obviously difficult for them to care about it. There are some, so far on the mailing list, we had a couple of people who produce operating systems, IoT operating systems, and they seem to care enough to participate. And we had David speaking earlier. He works on MCU boot. We had Manuel. He works on the Riot OS. We have our operating system, Mbed OS. Huawei has an operating system. And if we manage to reach out after we create such a group, to reach out to more IoT operating system vendors, then hopefully they will care. But of course, it's hard to say upfront before we have actually started whether anyone cares about the outcome of the work.
So I want to run through and see if I've correctly captured the feedback from the room on the charter text. And we won't necessarily do the wordsmithing right now, but I want to see if we have captured the intent correctly. And then as chairs and AD, we can go off and do the wordsmithing to try to match the intent. Right? And so let me know if I miss a question mark. I'm going to start at the top and down the question marks. The first comment was we want to reduce the text about 4108. I heard people saying that it should either not mention or mention only in passing at best, as opposed to concentrate on 4108. I did not hear anybody arguing to keep 4108 text. And so I think the intent is to remove as much as possible the scoping text around what we will do with respect to 4108. Okay. I think I've captured that correctly. If you disagree that you think that we need to keep text specifically about 4108, hum now. I heard very tiny hums. And so if you think that we should remove all text of 4108, please hum. Okay, and that was not a binary question because in between there is leaving some text and passing, right? And so if you think that it's useful to leave 4108 text in passing but not say that we'll do an update to it, but still mention it, please hum. Okay, so I think I heard slightly louder hums in the second one, but pretty close between second and third. Okay, great. The second one is about the relationship to Class 1 devices, and I think I heard people saying that it should not be constrained to Class 1 devices, and the text should be updated to make that clearer that it is not updated. This is the part that Dave summarized and Kathleen nodded, and so I think they have a pretty good idea of what they want it to say with respect to this, but I did not hear anybody arguing that it should be constrained to Class 1 devices.
Customer, the point is not about constraining things to Class 1 devices, but building things so Class 1 devices can participate.
Correct. Right. The intent is to make sure that any solution coming out of here would be capable of applying to a Class 1 device. It is not solely for Class 1 devices, but it shouldn't have a dependency that would not fit on a Class 1 device. That is the intent. Okay. I see various nods and things. Okay, so I'm going to keep going on. The next one is about what is out of scope. And so we talked about not defining any new transport protocols. I think we mentioned this a couple times, that use of transport protocols discussion is in scope when we talk about architecture. Defining new ones is not. And the related point that is both up here and down here, so I'll ask it now, is the notion of how do I discover the place that I get stuff from should be in scope. I heard people arguing for that. I think even the manifest format proposal includes some discussion of that, and certainly architecture would. And so I think the intent is that this discussion of discovery is in scope, but as Paul, I think it was Paul that mentioned, new discovery protocols are out of scope. Is that what I've heard? I see Paul nodding. I don't see anybody jumping up that they disagree with that. If you disagree with that, wave or something if you want to have something to say on that. Martin?
Yeah. Dave, maybe you can say, address the new question separately from the discovery question so that we can talk about the discovery thing.
Okay, fair. Would you like to phrase the question for me then?
So I think the point here is that we're not going to define any new protocol mechanisms for the delivery of the images.
Okay. So, all right. So I understand your suggestion is something like what's out of scope is new protocols for delivery, regardless of whether it's for transport or discovery.
Right.
Find some wording like that.
And then we can involve discovery at a leisure later. Yeah.
Okay. Yep.
I think it's not clear if everybody has the same scope of discovery, right? I think most people think of discovery of a server where to download from, and I've been talking about discovery of the capability of the device or what it needs. The firmware to be signed
yes,
with.
That's actually a separate bullet. So Torless here is the placeholder for capabilities of the device, and that's separately of discovery of update servers. Okay. And here, this is the discovery of update servers mechanism. I haven't yet gotten to that one. So, yeah. Okay, good clarification.
So we could, I think it's useful to do a hum on defining new transport mechanism. So what I would like to pose is the question: should we avoid the development of new transport mechanisms? Yes or no? For yes, please hum. Okay. For no, please hum. So definitely much louder on yes.
Not ubiquitous, but I heard a strong consensus for the. the next question mark is the mentioning in the charter as opposed to leaving to the documents. The notion of the architecture or some other way of encompassing I put it as a placeholder in the architecture, right? A way of a description of the capabilities of a device or some notion that says, how do I discover and negotiate the capabilities of the device? We'll have to figure out what the right wording is, but the question is, should the charter have text about the capabilities of the device being sort of key to what the group will do? So if you believe that we need text to talk about sort of capability in negotiation or discovery or whatever the right term is, something in that category, if you think we need text to address this, because right now there's no text that mentions this, right? If you think the charter text...
I'm not sure if it's capability of the device, right? It's just whatever is necessary for a successful firmware download. I think those are the bounding criteria.
The question here is whether you think we need charter text or whether the charter is okay in the absence of this and leave it to the document. Okay, that's the actual question. Okay, so if you think that the charter needs text about this, please hum. If you think it is sufficient to leave it out of the charter but into the architecture document discussion, please hum. Okay, I heard hums for the latter. Okay, and so I'm going to leave it in here as my placeholder, but I'm going to annotate no on this one. Okay, and so we've already talked about the discovery of update servers. Here we go. And so I think maybe the last one during this discussion is the notion of should the charter constrain us to having one manifest encoding format, or should the charter not mention any constraint? Because if the charter doesn't mention a constraint, that means it's up to the working group to make that decision post-charter. If it's in the charter, it means we're precluded from having that discussion. So if you believe the charter should constrain us to doing one, please hum. If you believe the charter should not have a constraint and should not mention this, and it's just part of the working group's work to decide that, please hum. Okay, I heard a strong hum for not mentioning the word one here. Okay, and so again, I will say no just to record that, and I'm hoping the note taker will also record that too. We'll figure out some wording that does not constrain us. Okay, that is the end of my question mark things. Is there any other things that we wanted to pull that I have missed? AD, are we missing anything that we should be humming for at this point on the charter? Okay. Yeah.
So, sorry, Dave. I think I missed the discovery question.
Okay.
Was I not paying attention
servers?
enough? Yeah. Probably.
Okay.
What did we conclude?
Redo that one then.
And I believe
No,
the question,
don't redo it. Tell me what your answer was.
I believe we haven't addressed that question, and I believe the point was that the charter should suggest that we allow some flexibility around the discovery of servers for retrieving firmware updates. Is it?
I think you're right. I think I actually didn't ask that as a question. I should, so thank you. So I think the question is, if you feel that the charter, as opposed to the documents, if you think the charter should mention that we will do work on discovery of update servers. I think that was how the original comment was phrased. If you think we need to have some charter text about that, okay, and there might be multiple reasons to say yes, multiple reasons to say no. The question is, do we need to work on any charter text updates? If you think we need to have a charter text update, please hum. If you think we do not need a charter text update and it just goes into the discussion of actual documents, please hum. Okay, I hear it as being the latter, that we don't need charter text. It's perfectly fine to leave that to the discussion of the document. Thank you.
This is Hank. I'm at least a little bit confused if we covered the first discovery question, actually. I think we skipped that.
This one?
Yeah.
This was whether we will say that we will not define any new discovery protocols.
So because the not
and
also
what we
not
said
for,
then
okay.
was that the group would prefer rephrasing this to not mention transport or discovery, and so
I'm
it won't
getting it.
define any new sort of transfer or some term that means either one and sort of is agnostic to what we won't do. Which types of protocols we won't do. That's what I captured as the intent of that one.
I think the only point is with discovery and capability, those things that's more communication than just a mechanism to transport firmware images, right? So I think
Yeah, when
the
you get into
update
discovery,
solution.
what's a protocol and what's not, when you're talking about how you might use an existing one, gets a little bit fuzzy. So like, it's kind of nice if the community thinks that we don't have to have text in the charter, because that can be really hard.
No, but the point is that anybody can reject anything about capabilities and discovery and anything by pointing to this first block a firmware update solution consists of, right? So I think that is too constraining, that text.
Which text are you pointing to?
A firmware update solution consists of, well, okay, it has several components including, but I mean, that's where things like discovery or capability, discovery of service, capability of devices, that would be additional communication
You have a
things.
proposed change.
Yeah, good question.
If the answer
You
is
could
not
say
yet, you'll think
including
about it, that's
but
a
not
fine
limited to.
answer. That's what including means. Okay. So at this point, I think we want to call time on the charter discussion because we have one other slide that David wants to cover. Do you want to go to that now, or is there anything else? What's our next step? I think we're going to have to
So we can jump into Before we do that, we do have one last proposed change from Jabber I'd like to read.
Go ahead.
This is from Colin Jennings. Proposed change. The architecture should provide a way to discover the firmware server. That is a proposed change from Colin Jennings on Jabber. I'm not sure where that text fell in the charter text. Colin, maybe if you could point out where that
I
text
kept
was
that in my
supposed to
head.
go.
That's the text that Colin was proposing there, or something close to that. Okay. And so, do people think that Colin's text should be added to the charter? Please hum. You might not know yet. Because my sense of the room before was that no, but if you think the answer was no, that the charter text does not need this to be mentioned exclusively, it's okay to leave the architecture document, please hum. A bunch of people either didn't care or didn't understand the question. Say it slower. Okay. Cullen proposes the following sentence. The architecture should provide a way to discover the update server, or some wordsmith variation thereof.
Do you want to have the
firmware
questions
update
first?
server? Okay, thank you. The firmware server. Okay. Yeah, we're just trying to capture exactly what you put in the chat. Okay, there we go.
Wait, sorry, can you explain the difference between discovery of update servers and the discovery of firmware servers?
Apparently, no in 2 minutes. We can't.
Yeah.
And we're going to have to take that conversation.
Dave, I was wondering whether this would exclude cases where you actually push the firmware to the device and there's no update server, or other cases where you have the server pre-configured and it gets the server from there, which is another uncommon case.
That's why, in my opinion, it's better to say less and leave it into the architecture document discussion. Yeah.
Because I would like to just make sure that those deployments are included. I'm not against having the possibility or an optional part in there.
Right. I believe that is a valid argument for arguing for or humming no on that question.
So, and I'm sorry, I thought that the hum on discovering of update servers was a yes when we just went through it. That came back as a no? No, not on Cullen.
Correct.
The original question of update servers, not firmware servers. Okay.
People believe that the architect, my recollection here, maybe note taker can help me verify, my co-chair, is that discovery mechanisms are in scope for the architecture, but we didn't necessarily need specific text in the charter to say that.
That's correct.
Okay, I have 2 yeses, that's what we said. Okay, great. So Dave wanted to then go to our last slide because we're almost out of time, and so I'm going to hand it back to Dave here for wrap up. So that's the slide you wanted, yes?
Yes. So we're going to gather immediately after this and start working on addressing all of these changes to the charter. Probably within the next few days, we'll have hopefully real soon we'll have an updated charter back on the list so that we can continue the charter conversation. So I wanted to have a brief discussion about how we might move forward with this effort if it's chartered. So if it's chartered, we'll obviously meet at IETF 101. But is there interest in the room in... We weren't able to actually have much conversation today about potential solutions and architectural concerns. Is there interest in the room in having a virtual to start to discuss that? I'm seeing some nods. Can I get a show of hands of who might attend? So we have maybe 20 people.
Yeah. And
Okay.
Jabber Scribe, any additional hands that you see? Okay.
Okay, well, it sounds like that's
Thank you.
something that we
So
should
that
look
puts us
into.
More than 25, then. Thank you.
Thank you. So with that, I think we can conclude this BOF. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you for a productive discussion.